Network Automation Nerds podcast. Hello and welcome to Network Automation Nerds podcast. On this podcast, we talk about network engineering, network automation, Python, and a range of other topics. I'm your host, Eric Cho. Tonight on the show, we'll be talking to John Capobianco, creator and lead developer of the Merlin Project. If you're into network automation, you should be very familiar with John's work. He's very active on social media and sharing his content, mentoring and helping others. And I would say just a really cool dude to be around with. So let's dive in. I know we're gonna have a fun, engaging conversation. Welcome to the show, John.
Oh, thank you, Eric, for having me. We started this great conversation. Eric and I have become pretty good friends over the last couple of weeks, and I'm really happy to be here. I've really supported your effort to launch this platform and this stream. You have a lot of important things to say. I'm really happy to be here. We were comparing notes about DevNet Create today and some of the really neat things we saw, and. Yep. And thank you again for having me, Eric. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about anything, man. Python, Ansible, playbooks, Git. Let's do it, man.
Yeah, let's go. But let me, before we do that, like we said, today was you might be hearing this podcast or watching this YouTube video at a later date, but today was actually day one of DevNet Create 2021. And let me be the first. Well, I'm sure I'm not the first, but let me be the first to be on the stream to congratulate John for being selected as one of the community contributor or community creator award as one of the three recipients, and it's well deserved. And congratulations, John. Clap, 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 man. It's well deserved.
Oh, thank you so much. I was saying I'm on this side of an adrenaline dump today, and I'm really emotional. Hopefully, there's not too much tear streaks from my face, but I'm really moved. And publicly, I said I kind of accept this on behalf of everyone who supported me through this journey and over the years. It really is about community and so many ideas that are shared with me, and I've inspired some other projects. So the award was great. I was saying it's rare that my mom and dad share anything other than despicable me memes on Facebook. Today they were sharing DevNet Create stuff. So that was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah, they were like, I don't know what DevNet is, but they're talking about John. This must be great. Let me just go share, like, share.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah, I mean,
well, they're not. They're pretty computer literate parents. What
got it.
I'm really thankful for, and I looked it up for tonight to prepare for tonight in case it came up. When I got started, and I was a kid. I was like 10. So in 1988, I started on a 286 IBM clone, running Microsoft DOS 3.2. So with a 2400 baud modem. Okay. Now the modem is important here because my younger brother and I started a bulletin board system. Now this is way back. So a lot of maybe younger viewers are saying, what's a bulletin board system? There was a system before the public internet, before you went to www.whatever, where you phoned people's computers with your computer, and you could have a bulletin board system. And we were very young kids, but seeing actually seeing someone type hello on my computer at a very young age sparked a lifelong interest and passion for computers and for technology. And I'm very fortunate that I've been able to work and transition into a career in technology. I didn't always do IT. I went back to school. I was working as an aluminum factory heavy gauge machine operator, and I decided that I wanted to change my life. So I went back to school to learn programming, and everything kind of went from there.
Yeah, so kids, gather around the fire. Let's talk about, we used to use the phone line to dial into some ISP, and it'll be like, "Hey, mom, can you get off the phone? Because I need to get on the internet." And then the mom will go, "Oh, okay, that's fine. What's this beep 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 sound?" But yeah, anyways, so I think that's what you were talking about. We all, I don't know. I mean, at least I remember, dialing into AOL with the 200 free hours, those CD-ROMs that that gets mailed to your house. But yeah, no, that's fun, man. That's interesting. We,
But
we kind
if
of came from the same
what
background.
yeah, what's neat to me is if you think about that progression. I know a lot of people think about CPU speeds or say hard drives moving to solid state. Like my network experience started with 2400 baud, which
Hmm.
isn't even bits. It's actually less than bits per second.
Right,
Per
right,
second, right? And
right.
now we have what's the fastest interface speeds? We have 400 gigs. Have
For
we
sure,
gone
yeah.
fast?
Like, exactly, exactly. So it's like 4 by 100, or you can like split that even more. So, but yeah, for sure. No, so like people were talking. Interesting, you mentioned it, right? So people were talking about compression, and why do we even care about when you're talking about 24K or 24 100 bots? That, I mean, that really makes a big difference. Yeah, if you could save one character, I mean, that's 5x the performance. But
Oh yeah, it was quite the time, that Stone Age period. But but the thing is, like it was almost people didn't believe that it was going to change the world. Like there was a lot of people who thought it was going to stay in the garage like the ham radio. Like it wasn't always foreseen that the home computer would take over and client server and then the internet and then the cloud and right it was sort of this niche hobby. You had to go find the computer parts store to buy the ribbon cable, and it was different. It wasn't this new world it's a post analog world, right? It's a fully digital world now. Even radio signals, the earth has gone silent if you look at it from space, right? There's no more analog signals. The radio has gone digital. It's
Right.
actually quiet now. And maybe that's why the aliens don't get a hold of us, is because we've gone digital and there's no more radio waves. I don't know, right?
Right. So they couldn't intercept all the analog signals anymore. But no, let's okay. So we've gone down this path, but I want to roll back a little
Yeah,
bit
let's
and
roll
get it
back.
back to say, okay, you like we want to talk about how you get into IT. You mentioned a little bit about, hey, you were on the BBS board, and you were having that experience must have helped you. And you mentioned your parents were pretty computer illiterate, so they may have helped you a little bit. So tell us a little bit about how you get into just this computer in general, and then maybe a little bit about how you get into networking. But we want to dive more into that.
Yeah, so to make a conscious decision
Hmm.
at the time, and I still think it's a very relevant exam depending on the field you want to get into. But for me, it started with the A plus, the CompTIA A plus certification.
Okay.
And if you go to my about page there,
Yep.
I was bouncing around after I graduated as a programmer. One thing that placement right there with the Ministry of Health,
Hmm.
in my final year of college, we do a placement, a co-op with an organization in the local community to get us some field experience from our resume, maybe roll over to a full-time job. I actually ended up as a systems officer, it was called, doing more client server and networking. And my first big project to date myself was to migrate from OS2 Warp to Windows 2000 on every client in the Ministry of Health's network. That was my year-long project, that if I pulled it off, I would graduate with a positive review from the ministry. And
So
and,
that
and
was
I
the Y2K bug, and the world was going to end at when that
you
click, right?
nailed it. You nailed it. So now, if you're interested, that was I called it SneakerNet because you had to put your sneakers on and go to
Yeah. Right.
every desktop with a Norton Ghost boot disk to join the
Right.
multicast, and
Yes.
then we did what was called ghost casting and
Hmm.
pushed this new Windows 2000 image out. You know
Right.
what's interesting? this to me was the first time in the field as a student that I actually saw networking concepts that when I was learning them, I didn't put them into, it was hard to, what's TCP versus UDP?
Right.
Like tactile, right? Well, this boot disk I just talked about, I made it with TCP. And my senior engineer came, he brought by another disk and said, okay, try my disk and let's time the two. And his was like, I don't know, a third, maybe even less. Like it was really fast. And I was really amazed at this. And he said, I changed the flag to UDP and I have all that less overhead now. And the thing just screams, right? So I was really interested in understanding networking that we could actually affect the flow and like shave hours off something like re-imaging desktops.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Yeah, no, that's interesting. So so that was kind of a the difference between like a thin client where you just have, the heavy settings in the back end versus something that's like full blown desktop. But that's kind of interesting where you mentioned that was the first time you put two and two together and say, oh wow, that is how it's done, like that's how the sausage was made.
Yeah, it really was. So then, in terms of my certification path, I was,
Yep.
and also on it's so different now, and I'm so happy for the new generation that has things like sandboxes, even things like virtual machines. Like my A plus was physically ripping apart a tower and figuring it out. And this giant, I remember this giant red, it was called Exam Cram, the book, big
Yeah.
red cover. And
Yeah.
they were very popular series at the time.
Yeah,
They
I
weren't
remember
dumps.
reading
They,
that
they
book
weren't
too.
dumps or anything. It wasn't cheating.
No, no, no,
CompTIA
no, it
endorsed them and
wasn't.
everything, right?
Correct.
I just want to make that distinction that it's very important to use credible sources and to really, you will be interviewed on your skills if you pass a cert or you claim to have passed one. So then you're going to see a whole list of Microsoft exams because that was at the time for me an opportunity in the industry. I had more opportunities in XP to Vista and then into the server space. I bought a big box set of the Microsoft Certified Enterprise Administrator, it was called, and it had all the books you needed and all the labs you needed, and it was very in-depth box set of books that I worked very hard on. Now listen to this, and it took me a long time. I don't know what the first exam that I passed in the series was. So August 2008, the Vista, and then if you scroll down, I'm not sure when I passed the Enterprise Admin, October 2019 or something. All that time, every minute of every day, just like you see me now doing open source work, except grinding Microsoft Labs, group policy objects, like really neat stuff. And I went in with I passed my enterprise admin, and the company said, "That's great. We're reorging next week, and we're moving you to the networking platform because you have your Network Plus." And I said, "No, I don't think you understand what this means. This is 7 Microsoft. I could run the whole domain admin. I've got plans. You should see this." And they were like, "No, like we really need you to be on the networking now full time. You've done a wonderful job hyper virtualizing the network, and we've eliminated all this bare metal." Now, this was in a private insurance company in Kingston, Ontario called Empire Life. I still have a pretty good relationship with them. We did a digital transformation there. But then, so I sort of struck a deal with them. I was aware that to get, that most successful enterprise network admins that I knew had their CCNA. And so I told the organization I'd be happy to join the networking team, but I'd like to be sent on the boot camp. And I found a provider that had a 60-hour boot camp for CCNA. And that's when I got my CCNA, and everything else from there has been one Cisco exam after another. And I've really enjoyed it. I think the CCNA of all these exams including that Microsoft Enterprise Admin. That CCNA was very difficult. That was a very challenging exam because of the width of the exam. Even with my Network Plus Foundational and Microsoft networking exams, that Cisco CCNA was very tough. But talk about opening doors, both personally and professionally, and in the career and in the industry.
Right.
That exam really did change. You can kind of pinpoint different key milestones in your looking back.
Right.
That to me was a big milestone. Was adopted. It was saying, you know what, I think the network is actually where my career future is, not necessarily compute or Microsoft, that I still have an affinity for, and has really helped me actually be a successful network engineer. You can really understand DNS and DHCP and group policies and the effect of these things on your clients and servers. Very important to my career. But I've kind of picked, they handed me lemons and I tried to make lemonade.
Yeah.
And I've loved it. I've loved every second of it.
I'm glad you said that. So by the way, if you're listening to the podcast and if John was referring to a website, so it's automateyournetwork.ca/about. So it's one of John's website. And if you're watching on the YouTube video, of course, you'll see, we're scrolling through on his kind of a career in IT. But if you're listening, just to summarize that, so John started out in college. He got into Windows, kind of this Windows realm, did his Network Plus, and for would you say like the first, I don't know, 10, 12 years, you were all very Microsoft focused. And then, the surprise, they say, hey, you're the guy who has Network Plus, so, you should join our networking team. And then you went to the CCNA. And that kind of opened doors. I would kind of roger that. I would say, so I myself got my Network Plus as well, but I would agree that it's a big step between Network Plus because it was all fundamental and basic knowledge, right? But CCNA is actually hands-on, practical. It's almost as if you could go and start implementing stuff because of CCNA. Is that your take as well?
That is my take. And the CCN, so the Network Plus, very foundational. It's very important stuff. And it's hard for me to say, to put myself as a 20-year-old kid or whatever, who didn't know anything about really the OSI or subnetting or CEDR notation or things I kind of take for granted now.
Yeah.
Are very key to that exam. But the CCNA, and where my struggle was, it's not like today where we have the DevNet sandbox, right?
Yeah.
It was hard for me to get a Cisco job at the time. I got lucky that I was in a company and they put me on the network team, so I had access to gear. That really helped me pass the exam, was having access to gear. But someone who may not be already in the IT, I would suggest there's still a barrier there that you got to show this and show that, and what conft is versus enable mode versus, right, what's a boot flash and NVRAM, and some things you can only get through doing physical hands-on activities with a switch or a router. I would still believe that's true.
Right.
So then it was like, design associate. And then I went, so professional to me was always like, it was really a high level goal for me after my NA. I was like, wow, I'd like to actually try to be professional level and move into like I needed to know a lot more when I joined the networking team than I did, even with my CCNA. I was able to successfully operate and run the network, but there was a lot of opportunities, let me put it that way, in the enterprise that I was with. If they had someone who knew the switch book and the route book and the T-shoot book at the time, that was the stack of exams. Yeah. And the route book was like as big as the switch book and the T-shoot book combined, this giant tomb from RIP all the way to EIGRP and BG, everything in between. That was a very big step in my career. And I also want to let people know that I didn't pass every one of these exams on my first attempt. I'm very transparent about that. I think it's important for a couple of reasons. One, you should, I don't know who's watching this, Eric. There's a lot of people maybe new and haven't written an exam or looking to start their journey and look to us to inspiration. Be financially secure enough to fail an exam. Okay. It's a significant financial investment that there isn't a guarantee that you're going to pass it, no matter how easy you think it's going to be or how well prepared you think you are. There's always a chance of not succeeding. And I don't want to say failing, because I think the act of taking an exam, just going through the motions of the exam and the you've got to sign in and I got to give them my ID and I put all my stuff in the locker. There's a whole thing around the exam experience that isn't necessarily, some people would pass it otherwise if they could just be handed the test at home and they could write it. But you're put in this high pressure scenario with a clock running. There's no back button. So that's different than like when I came from the Microsoft and CompTIA world. I could go back. I don't know this question. I'm going to skip ahead and come back to it. Right. That doesn't fly on a Cisco exam. You've got one shot to block in your answer and move along, right?
Yeah, but I think at the time. No, I think at the time. So it's the NP exam is a little different now, but I think at the time, John, you were talking about. So 2014, that was 4 exams. So it was routing, it was switching, it was troubleshooting, and it was remote access, right? So as you were mentioning, the routing exam was pretty much, the routing and switching were probably bread and butter. And so those were like really, really, difficult exams to pass, and certainly a step up from just the NA level. So, going from nothing to CCNA, that was, kind of big and kind of a big jump. But going from NA to NP, I mean, just imagine the additional exam you were going to take. And each exam costs, I don't even remember, like in the US, I think it costs about $150. Oh, $300? Okay.
300 US, yeah.
Yeah, so if you fail once, right, like you almost feel if somebody punch you in the gut. But as you said, it's not about how many times you get knocked down, it's how many times you get back up. So it's great that you're saying it and be transparent about it, that it's not an easy exam, and just because you didn't pass it the first time doesn't mean you didn't get something out of it and learn from that experience.
Right. It's hard for me to say. I think I learned more from failing an exam, because now I got to go back to the official study guide, back to the sandboxes, start all over again. And really, I obviously I didn't perform well enough on that day, right? And that happens.
Sure.
Or I just didn't know the material well. It's a hard pill to swallow, right? But maybe I just didn't know the material well enough to pass a professional or an associate level exam. And that's okay. But I certainly learned more than, or knew more than when I started that attempt, right?
Right.
The other thing is, I'm going to give this tip, not a lot about the money and how you pay for it.
Sure.
If you are already employed and want to pursue more exams, I don't think it's a difficult conversation to have with your manager to say, look, it's a couple $100 in terms of the big budget of this enterprise I work for. What's $300 if I pass? Will you reimburse me if I bring you a past exam? Is a good way to maybe get paid back and find a way to have your employer cover the exam. I've been moderately successful doing that with that approach. Now, there's still some upfront cost, but anyway. So go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I think Cisco is certainly aware of the cost of exam. I mean, so I think for some situations, you actually get benefits, like material benefits from having X amount of CCNP, CCIE, or CCNA. on your staff. In fact, I think if you're a value-added reseller, you actually get discounts from equipment purchase, and that make that justification really easy. A lot of times, you actually have to do it because they want to maintain a certain level of quality in a partner, and so I think either however you could kind of convince your management to do it, like you have
Right.
done, John,
Right.
that would be a win.
Yeah, and the other thing is, like, I know when I was trying to get a Cisco Network Academy started when I was
Hmm.
doing teaching. So
Hmm.
in my around the same time,
Yeah.
I found I was working a significant amount of weekends and on call time.
Yeah.
And here's a funny story. It's funny how this world goes. I went to see Seinfeld with my wife to relax.
Okay.
He was in town, and I went and got very expensive seats. I really wanted to see this show. I needed to laugh, right? I needed
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Right.
Right behind me, literally right behind me, was my C++ programming instructor,
Oh, okay.
who was also still the head of the department at St. Lawrence College.
Right.
And we were laughing and talking, and she had heard about what I had done at Empire, the networking and stuff. And
Hmm.
I said, I just offhandedly, I said, so you don't happen to need a new networking instructor there, do you? Right?
Hint,
And
hint.
and she says, actually, Nick, your former professor, he was my professor, Nick. I said,
Yeah.
Nick was like 75 from Nortel when I was there 10 years earlier. He had just retired like that week. They had the cake and the whole goodbye to Nick, and they had a vacancy for a programming or a networking instructor. So
Right.
I that was my interview, Eric. I
Yeah.
didn't.
So it's interesting. I guess it's great that, not great, but it just so happens that all the networking engineer professionals are very stressed out, and they all need a good laugh when Seinfeld's in town. So that was so I pull up that page again. So that was around would you say like 2010, 2013 that you actually got it on the spot, and just great timing, and then you start teaching network design and go back to the St. Lawrence College for that. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, and actually Empire Life, they were very cooperative, and what we worked out was that my on-call and a lot of my overtime could go into X amount of hours a week at the college,
Mm-hmm.
because I have to I can't do two day jobs at the same time. And
Not
so we made this arrangement that, from 10 o'clock till noon on Tuesdays, I'll be at the college or whatever.
right.
And it was wonderful. One of the most rewarding experiences of my life, teaching college level age in particular. I don't know that I would do high school. There's so much depending on their future, but these are people that have paid money to come and learn networking, right? So it's
Right.
different. And it was very exciting and and you know what? I'm constantly reinforcing what I had learned in my CCNA, CCMP stuff, because I'm now trying to teach it and mentor another generation. And I work with the college to say, so that's what brought me to this. You mentioned the certifications for value-added resellers in
Right.
the academia space. You need to have two CCNX on staff in a college to get Network Academy.
Oh,
So
okay.
at least at the time, because I wanted to bring Network Academy as an official Network Academy at St. Lawrence College. And
Right.
I had to convince another professor to get his CCNA, and it just never materialized. It just never materialized. I was very enthusiastic. I tried very hard, but I couldn't get the college. No, it's not the college's fault. It was hard to do.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's the importance of certification, are things like certified network academies if you're in the academia space or whatever.
Yeah.
So I did the teaching, a
Hmm.
Microsoft Windows domain design course with
Hmm.
group policies, and so enough for them to get I think it was the 7640 exam. That's probably right. Actually, my memory's pretty good. I think that was the exam my course was designed for. And
Hmm.
the networking exam was designed for the CCNA.
Got
Um,
it. Got it.
And
Yeah.
in
So
the so listen to this. I show up in
yeah.
my second year to go back to the labs, and there's a whole construction crew back there, and they've got the whole wall between my lab and the other classroom ripped down. And
Oh,
there's a
okay.
whole construction crew there. I said, what's going on? And
Yeah.
he didn't know. He said, I don't know, the teachers in this room have been complaining about some loud professor in this lab. And it's so loud with laughter and noise, and it's so rambunctious that we're putting in soundproofing in the wall between this lab and this other classroom. I said, that's me that you're soundproofing because of.
Right,
So that
right.
was fun. That was fun.
Yeah, that's fun. That's an interesting story, but there was a lot to be unpacked back there, right? So you mentioned, you were enjoying teaching. You were able to work out this arrangement with your Empire Life employer, so you could still get a full time job. You're still working full time as well as enjoying your part time in teaching. And I think that translates well into what you're doing now. It's you could always see this passion for you to share, to mentor others, and always willing to offer advice. And I think that kind of matches what you're doing now. And of course, people say uh teaching is twice learning, learning twice, so or
Right.
something like that. So
Yeah.
definitely interesting. But there was no DevNet back then, right? Now, if you're into Python network automation, you could just go for the DevNet route, and they lay out this nice roadmap for you. But back then, going from just kind of, for lack of better words, like CLI jockey
Yeah.
into, say, a automated world Python, and how did you get into that? Like, what was the trigger? What happened?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that we're going to flash forward a little bit.
Okay.
I had already joined the House of Commons, so they approached me to digitize and help rebuild their network, campus, data center, wide area net, like every aspect of a network on a very ambitious project. And I was so fortunate, and I'm still very fortunate to work for such an amazing organization and such a iconic organization.
Right.
Our Parliament building, it now has wireless, partly because of my efforts, and that's something I'm very proud of, right?
Right. Nice.
So that's kind of neat stuff. But here's the problem: there's one thing to build. So I
Mhm.
think you would agree with me, and maybe you could comment. A day zero network, we've bought all the gear, we're going to wire it, we've got these VLANs and these VRFs and these routes and these ACLs and whatever it is we need, top to bottom, all the appliances, we're going to build it, and we've built it.
Mhm.
That's a different challenge than day one plus of now we have to change it and monitor it and operate it and talk to it and adapt and adjust it and enhance it. Those are very different problems. And the second set of problems, I felt I had to move to automation.
Mhm.
I had no choice but to find a different way to do my job, because at the scale and the complexity that I was dealing with, and sort of the siloed nature of our industry, waterfall wasn't working for me anymore.
Mhm.
And there was one particular challenge. So imagine a QoS policy change at scale through the CLI. It, you have to change everything for cohesive end-to-end QoS policy, the markings, the queuing, all of it. It's hard enough to do by itself, I would say, QoS. I bought
Mhm.
the Cisco Quality of Service book. It was a big project of ours. And then it came time to roll it out. I'm telling you, stack by stack, night after night, CLI after CLI. And I don't want to be unfair to any of the human operators, but someone's in the wrong context. They're on the wrong device. They've got the wrong code. They've got the wrong version of the code. They're, who knows what, they've typed the wrong thing. Their thumb hit the space bar.
Right.
All of these human things were getting in the way of my agility, of what the business needed. I'm not there to do it for the network engineers. I'm doing it for the business. And the business needs quality. because we have security cameras and VoIP phones and right, like it's there to support a service for the business and the enterprise. And I think that's lost on a lot of network automation folks. I try to do my automation with a lens on how it can benefit my organization and reduce friction, and how maybe, like, okay, so then, right, we're talking about finding automation solutions. For me, it was Ansible at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And like, wonderful. A hosts and group var files, a host INI file with my inventory, a little bit of credentials, some simple tasks to serially and sequentially do what a human was doing a few days before I found the tool. So that is what drove me to do it, was a real world pressure to get things off of the planning stage and development stage. There was a big friction in this waterfall to the operations stage.
Mm-hmm.
But what it did was transform much more than just, okay, now we're using a playbook instead of the CLI. It transformed the way I was working with my operators and my architects and my designers, and source control, and these things started to become introduced to me over time. I didn't start with version control. I didn't know anything about Git. I didn't start with VS Code even. I started with Notepad files in YAML, TFTP them to a CentOS server, run the playbook. Anything wrong happens, send the file back through TFTP and call it like version 2, didn't work.
Right.
Try this, try that, send it back, iterate over it. So do you have any comments? What was what drove you from a classic network engineer to say, I need to do something differently? And that might not have been Python for you at the time. I don't know what your first attempt was, but I'm very curious that's what drives me, is to know why you started to think a different way, Eric. What do you think?
Yeah, so going back to what you were talking about, so the reason you kind of get started with network automation first was, the order of operation was important, right? So your cross policy needs to be end to end, but making change at one device at a time was risky, and it doesn't get the job done because there's always the fallout. So that was the first thing, your speed of and order of operation. And then the second was because you were so the scope was big and the operation was complex, so you have to human error becomes into a play, especially at 2 a.m. in the morning or whatever maintenance window that was. Then that becomes an issue.
Right.
So those two issues, I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's what
No,
you mentioned,
bang
and
on.
that was what
Yeah.
drove to that. So for me, it was kind of the same thing. I was working for a public cloud provider at the time, and I told the story at some other occasions, but I'll summarize it again here as well. So I was troubleshooting an issue. Well, of course, this is a gradual process, right? Like you never, it's not a change overnight, but what symbolized this whole process was one day I was troubleshooting a issue with an engineer from another team, and we were just going through logs, and we were trying to determine what the issue was, whether it was a networking issue or whether it was an application issue or whatnot. And it was just a tremendous amount of logs that we have to go through. And he fired up his Perl scripting language, and did some magic, did some regular expression matching magic, and go, oh, well, I don't think it's my issue. And I agree, right? I totally agree. Like, from the log and the result that he did, it clearly showed it wasn't an application issue. So obviously it was a networking issue, or at least it's something that warrants looking further. But me, as being just a traditional network engineer at the time, I was going through logs and logs and logs. So he went home at 5, happily went home at 5. And I stayed there 5 additional hours just to troubleshoot. And toward the end of the night, I looked up and I'm like, oh my God, I got to get some of that Pearl magic. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, those 5 hours, if I just spend 5 hours learning it, then I perhaps I at least have a shot at it, right? I don't dream of going from 0 to hero. in 5 hours, but at least I want to be on the right path. I want to go on down that path. So that's kind of summarized, my trigger for it. And of course, as you know, that with larger companies, with lots of equipments, it matches to what you were saying about human error and just the complexity. Just at scale, everything breaks. I think it was James Hamilton who said that. He was the I don't even know his exact title, but he's definitely one of the leaders who designed Microsoft's VO2 design, and also he later on went to AWS, did a bunch of keynotes and drive the direction. So I think he said at scale everything breaks. So so like you said, right, like really is to facing this complexity challenge, to face that, like, and it doesn't. And I think one of the misconception, and you could chime in after this, but one of the misconception is automation. If you learn automation, you're just going to automate yourself out of a job, which has not been the case for me for the last 10, 12 years since I started doing this. Is that you just automate the boring stuff. You automate the stuff that you don't want to do, so it allows you to focus on the stuff that you want to do. And it's a never ending journey, right? Like you constantly discover, as I see that winkle in your eye. Like, you constantly discover new stuff that you just fall in love with. So you never automate yourself out of a job. You just automate yourself out of these boring tasks that you don't want to do anyways, and you get to go home at 5. How nice is that? So what are your thoughts on that, John?
I completely agree. I don't think there's any risk of automating yourself out of a job, or maybe even other people out of a job. I agree with you. Boring, repetitive tasks can be eliminated and automated. Big bang, we do this once a year type inventory things may be easily automated. Anything that you find yourself doing more than 3 times a day or 7 times a week, or come up with a little scale for yourself. There should be a tipping point where the little bit of time you would invest to just automate that out of your life versus continually doing that same thing. It's a no-brainer just to take the time and automate it. And then you can be freed up to work on what I think your companies are paying you to work on, solving problems. You're not paid to know how to CLI in and say VLAN 10 name blue on 1,000 routers. Honestly, like, do you really think that's what your skill, what you're bringing to that organization? I don't think so. I would argue no, right? You're there to solve problems, and you happen to know how to solve network problems. And we have a whole new set of tools. Some of them aren't even new. I feel like a broken record talking about Ansible at times. It's been around long enough that I think most modern network engineers should be able to make a playbook. Now, here's what really opened our eyes collectively. And I want to give a shout out to a gentleman named Carl Buckman, who I used to work with very closely, who was a big mentor of mine early in my Ansible days. And he's gone on to do some great things with Arista and Ansible validated designs. But he was in the room because we wrote this playbook together. And Eric, you know what was neat? We didn't even rely necessarily on Ansible. We sort of used it kind of like how Terraform's using it, to be more of like a declarative delivery model. So what we did was we had intended configs that we used Ansible to put into all these devices.
Right.
And then we used the config replace capability to make that candidate config the running config, and then use Ansible to either roll it back or commit it depending on some testing we were doing.
Right.
I would still do that approach today. I don't dislike Ansible. It has its place. And that was a wonderful step. In 2018, we did this of pushing out 300 target config files, triggering a config replace and validation. And it took 45 seconds or something. There was 15 of us in the room, including Carl and a few others. And I remember saying, I'm really sorry. I apologize to everybody. I must have got something wrong. And then the operator said, no, look at show whatever, the new configs are there at scale in a few minutes, right? And we were
Yeah.
cheering and celebrating, and it was like, okay, I see, like it really was, the clouds had kind of parted and the sun was shining on me, and I was like, this is something that I want to do for the rest of my career, is solve problems this way. It really was exciting to me. And I did that with Ansible, and I did that with Cisco native. Everyone can do config replace, right?
Sure.
So
That's
what
funny.
about you?
Like,
Did you have like an early success though, Eric, that let you go, yeah, I think I'm onto something here?
um, there's no clear like a winning moment for me. But what you described there, it's almost like a real life Phoenix Project moment, right? Like if you haven't read that book, you should, like for our audience, if you have, it's a very entertaining book and it's about DevOps, and it kind of started this whole trend, but it was similar to what you were talking about, right? The first time that they saw this happen, and it's almost like opening up a whole new world, and they're just so happy and everybody's cheering. For me personally, I don't think there's any like aha moment that I could recall. I'm sure there were, but it was just kind of gradually churning away. I mean, there's small wins along the way. I remember the first time, because I was at a cloud provider at the time, so there's a bunch of developers, and there was a very hairy bug from the vendor, and we're experimenting. I mean, we're always pushing the edges of the vendor's capability, but there was
Right.
a very hairy bug that required us to go into every other switch and balance the traffic a certain way, right? And so that the bug was that it was supposed to be evenly distributed, but it's not. So we need to make some manipulation to do every other switch, and make some kind of little configuration change, but it's all of them at the same time, and it has to be like odd numbered switches, right? So some,
Right.
and we were just bending our head, and then we're, it's almost like we're down to like, okay, you do these 40 switches, you do these 40, and so on. But then I had a script that actually goes in that I could just change one thing, right? Like, as you know, that you only have to make one little, like, the +1 to make the switch number odd or something like that. So I had a script that goes in
Right.
and do the change, and it was hacky, it wasn't pretty, it was, just like something that I hacked together for myself. And but they ended up using it, solved that bug, and the developers were impressed. And that was kind of there's a bunch of small moments like that for me, that I think back and say, okay, those were the times that I really get encouraged to those small wins. And like when you're actually able to solve your own problem, it's really a fantastic feeling. And I think that's what we both feel, for younger engineers. If they're really getting into it, set a goal and find one problem to solve, and it will actually keep you on this path, because you're going to bump into difficult ceilings. You're going to bang your head. It's a difficult route, like no doubt about it. You're going to be frustrated. But if you have these little wins like John and I had, then you're able to, just be motivated, propel yourself, and just continue down that path, right? Go through these bumps in the road, and eventually you'll hit a place where you have a even longer success. So John, if I hear you correctly, so you started out with Ansible, you had a bunch of wins, and at the same time, you were getting into Python, as you mentioned. Ansible is getting more and more into a declarative state. Whereas, so do you want to go into what's the difference between imperative and declarative?
For sure. So imperative is very much a serial, and you can watch this with even with something like pyts.config.
Yeah.
So just because it's Python doesn't necessarily mean it's declarative, right?
Sure.
I want to make that distinction that even something like pyts.config module will serially, and if you run an Ansible playbook, typically, unless it's using the URI module or something, it's going
Hmm.
to log the CLI. Like let's say the iOS config module. NXOS config module. They run your lines of code serially as you declare them in your YAML file, which is great. That is a big, big win. And I think it would be, we could leave it at that, no problems, if we weren't dealing with the Cisco CLI. You change the VRF on an SVI, you have to re-input the IP address. It drops it when you change VRFs. It's one thing off the top of my head. Certain things overwrite when you say, I don't know, the IP address on an interface. Doesn't add one, it overwrites it. So that would be okay imperatively. But what about something like NTP servers or helper addresses where it doesn't overwrite the one you already declared, it adds another one? Well, think about how we shut, no shut interfaces. Seems simple enough, right? Well, no. The presence of the words no shutdown or the lack of those words become a problem with an imperative approach. And you're going to find more and more of these and trip over more and more of these where your automation might run just fine until somebody's changing something or until you have to what? Know something out. So then you're forced with the decision. Do I have a follow-up playbook that knows out and does a cleanup? Do I have my operators log in at the end of my playbook and know out anything that's not in my intent? These are problems with the imperative model. Why I like RESTconf, REST APIs, the post. So when we talk about CRUD activities, create, read, update, delete, we can update or create or delete the entire object declaratively, right? It's like that config replace I mentioned. It takes the whole target state and puts it into memory. Every interface is configured, every route is there. It does it seamlessly in memory with commit and configs and rollbacks. I believe Terraform is a declarative model where they're going to deploy a full entity in the cloud, whatever it is you're deploying in AWS or Azure or whatever. It's going to declare. And why can they do that? Because the cloud's built with REST APIs. And they're probably abstracting a bunch of posts in their domain-specific language. That would be how I would do it.
So I think what you were talking about, just so you know, we're on the same page, is there. So if you're doing something, you know, imperatively, then to make an admin interface out, you might just do no shut. You said so. You have exact command execute, but to do it declaratively, you might just say admin state, and you would say true, or you would say up, and it doesn't really matter how you do it. You know, so a smart tool might just go in and say, okay, what is the interface state now? If it's shut, I would no shut it. If it's up, I would just leave it alone, or something like that. So I think that's what you were talking about being declarative, and you were bringing that even down to the API level and say it's declarative, but at a API level, and also, you know, so that's what, you know, you were talking about, I think, and then you were talking about Terraform. So at a framework level, that you could even be a declarative about something, and they would take care of the underlying OS for that. Is that true, John?
I think that's a good way to put it, maybe a better way, a more elegant way than I stated it. I like to think in terms of that API where, and I've done this where and you know, we have, say, a data model of some kind in some format, either a database or a YAML file where we declare our intent. I've got 10 VLANs and these are their names and whatever. We use a Jinja 2 or some templating language to generate. Right now, this is the difference with something that's imperative. You generate the actual CLI config stanzas that are executed serially. For a declarative model, you generate the entire intent as something like JSON, and you do a post, and it replaces the full state through the REST API. NX API, you can do this. REST API on netconf on. Now, I want to be transparent. I think you can do very cool things with something like NSO and the Yang models, or ACI or DNA Center. I think more and more we're moving towards actually declaring the state of our fabrics and our networks. So
Right.
it's pretty exciting transition. But in terms of, I don't get asked a lot, but people probably wonder, I've started speaking less and less about Ansible and more about Python and Python frameworks. And it wasn't because of any catastrophic trigger, or I didn't sour on Ansible. I had the fortune of the Cisco office and my office are very close. And I was doing some searching about PyETS, and I found a great blog post from Simming, one of the architects. And I noticed he lived in Ottawa. Pardon me. And I was like, hang on. And I looked up, and most of their team is in Ottawa. So I reached out to my Cisco team, my account reps and such, and said, is there any way you can put me in contact with this PyETS team? A demo, an introduction? Could you just, yeah, they'd actually love to show you what their tool system is about. Can you come over to our office on whatever next Thursday? So I actually got a private, personal tour and introduction from the horse's mouth from JB and Simming in person for about 15 minutes. Just a remarkable opportunity and stroke of luck that it was like Seinfeld. Hey, can I get a job? I was sort of like, hey, can I meet these PyETS guys? I was like, yeah, sure. They're 2 blocks away. Do you want to meet them tomorrow? So for that, I was using Genie inside of Ansible, and it seemed like a natural transition to shed the Ansible framework and adopt the PyETS framework, because I was really working with the Genie parsers anyway. And so in terms of timing, their Espresso tool, which is like an orchestration system to schedule PyETS jobs, free and open source, by the way, all these tools, it just became public. So that's when I learned about PyETS seriously, and the rest is sort of history. In terms of Django and why I adopted that, you're going to have Florian on, I believe, right, to discuss his work on Johan. He did an amazing series of blog posts, and that really inspired me to try Django. Just abstractly, Eric. I didn't really know what I was getting myself into, but I was like, listen, I have these PyETS jobs. Maybe they could work at the control level, and that JSON I'm getting, I could put in a database, and then I can use these views that they talk about to present it to the user. So that's the genesis of my latest iteration of Merlin, actually.
Yeah. So you mentioned Merlin, John. So let's pull back a little bit, because I think we kind of missed that part. So you, obviously you were automating your network with Ansible, and gradually you get into Python, and you gradually move a lot of your work into Python. Tell us the origin story of Merlin. So, like, how did it get started? What's the purpose? What problem is it trying to solve? And of course, I know you start integrating, PyETS, REST API into it. But before then, what was the Merlin project? And I'm gonna pull up the webpage for those of us who are on the stream to look at the Merlin project.
Okay, so it started actually from a lot of that Ansible work that I was doing. And one of the big things one of the messages I try to be very clear about for people starting their journey is that it's not necessarily about changing the network's configuration. I know that's what people want to do immediately with network automation, is start changing things. I really believe that you can safely ease into the deep end with network state capture. So running simple show commands, and with these parsers, getting the JavaScript object notation back. Now, where it started, Eric, was me manually using Jinja templates and the JSON and stitching together things like CSV files and HTML pages, things I call business-ready documents. So actually go up a little bit. Let me change repos here. So that's the Merlin. He's looking at Merlin here, which is still available and you can still use. But my latest iteration is actually a lot easier to use. If you go to the Merlin Unchained one, this is my Docker Django iteration of the project that you just had up. So it's very much evolution and scaffolding. I had all this stuff working at the CLI, but it was, I don't know, there was a lot of friction, and who wants 2,000 JSON files, right? Like, do you know what I mean? It was great, but it wasn't like what I really wanted to really make it easy for anybody in the business. You don't have to be a CCNA if you want the show inventory as a CSV file. You can just go to Merlin / show inventory and see what the show inventory looks like in a data table in a web page. And
So
I'm telling you, Django has been such a perfect fit to take network state, store it somewhere, and present it to users. That's really what it comes down to, Eric.
yeah, so I think what you mentioned a couple of things. So I think what you mentioned was you could ease into network automation. You don't really have to go, do forklift changes per se. You could actually just start by doing show commands and then have it in a way that you could consume, whether that's a CSV, whether that's a JSON file, or whether that's in the web portal. So that originally was your vision for Merlin. It's something that you publish out, and then you could show people. And the back end, you were using PyATS, the Genie parser, and all of that. But as you were saying, you're scaffolding, which means you're just continuously improving the way that you do things and make minor or major changes. So now you have Merlin Unchained, which was a bunch of Docker containers. Is that correct? Like, I mean, you should probably talk a little bit about kind of the overall, architecture of Merlin Unchained, I think.
So I tried to write a README file for Django. Like, so this very repo, I did a Twitter poll saying, what do you got? What does everyone want? And README won. And I was like, what did I do to you to hate me so much that you would pick a README file instead of more Python? But that's what the community wanted, right?
It's pretty.
No, but this is before this. Okay. So I wrote the README file, and Oren Brig, do you know Oren from Vanilla Ice and stuff?
Oh, no.
Anyway, he wrote Vanilla Ice, and you might want to have him on here, actually. Okay. Anyway, he tried to run it from my README file, and he hit a snag almost immediately. Okay. And I was like, what operating system are you running? I'm running CentOS. I said, well, I'm on Ubuntu. The README file's for Ubuntu. So then I'm like, okay, I got to write a CentOS README file. So then I backed up and said, you know what? I'm going to put all of this in Docker. Okay. So that's you can see there, you just have to clone the repo and then run Docker Compose up, and it'll bring up all this system in a container so that you can just go to localhost 8000 and have Merlin. Now, Merlin is Django with a post-GRE SQL database. Now, Django comes with MySQLite by default, but you can swap it out for post-GRE or other backends. Yeah. If you're curious why I swapped it out, I wanted to use the iContains search. Yeah. And I got an error that said, so this is the amazing thing about this modular approach with Django. I got an error that said MySQL doesn't support iContains. So I was like, okay, do I just swap out the database? And I did. And then it worked. Postgres is like, yeah, I have that. Right. So then all of these other containers are things like Elastic Stack and Flower for scheduling. It's really evolving. I don't want to take up too much time going over every nitty-gritty thing, but basically you can log in and click a button now, and it will run about a dozen learn functions from PyATS, learn BGP, learn interface, whatever, and give you nice HTML, sortable, searchable, printable views of that data. And the other thing I want to highlight, I know that it's the genesis is PyATS, but if you look closely, Eric, there's 6 or 7 Cisco APIs I'm using that I'm just using the request library for. I'm using the PyATS framework Meaning anything with a REST API. Pretty soon in Merlin, there'll be things like ICE state information from the ICE APIs, or Prime, or DNA Center, or ACI. Anything, it could be an F5, honestly. It's not necessarily vendor specific to Cisco. Yes, those show parse commands are, but if there's a, Arista or, Juniper, they've got APIs or they give back JSON. You could clone this if you're a Juniper developer and tweak a few things and use it for your Juniper network. I would be really happy to see somebody try that,
Yeah, for sure. So I think for people who don't know what Docker is or Docker Compose, so they're basically lightweight virtual machines, if you will, that is self-contained software, but it doesn't take up as much resources as a full virtual machine. So what John did with Merlin was actually to construct them into these little containers and run full-fledged Python framework called Django, which has the front end, which is these web pages that you see, but on the back end he also has a permanent database that stores stuff, which as you mentioned, he swap out the what is it, the SQLite with SQLite just a file, but it's not production ready. So he swapped it out of Postgres. But because Django abstracts those layers, that he was able to just say, instead of SQLite, go to Postgres, and that just works. And of course, he start adding all these other features and functions like scheduling, or just better polling of URL, and if you're looking at the project's README file that John so meticulously put together, that you can see all of these nice features that they covered. And of course, he uses PyATS on the back end to parse some of these, but at the same time, as he mentioned, a lot of these are just regular API calls. So therefore, anything that could accept API calls, then you could get the result back, parse it, and then be integrated into the Merlin project. So for somebody who wants to get started, what's the best way to kind of leverage Merlin, or kind of to contribute back into your code base? I mean, I see there's a lot of contributors out there. So do you have any suggestions?
It's been a lot of fun. So I've built it from the Nexus 9K sandbox for now. And I'm going to try to port it over to the Catalyst 9300 so that I have an iOS XE flavor and an NXOS flavor of devices. If you spin up those sandboxes and plug in the information, meaning fill in the devices table in Merlin, those buttons will just work on that sandbox. So if you just want to play with it and consume it for free, for nothing, you can spin up a container spin up a sandbox and use it. You could likely point it at a Lab Nexus piece of equipment, and it would work likely. The other thing is, if you'd like to contribute to it, go find a parser that I haven't done yet, get the JavaScript object notation, follow my steps, right? Make a Django model, make a migration into a model, and then work on the views. It's a lot of fun. And then it's like, so I should have maybe called it the Wizard of Oz instead of Merlin, I guess, because I'm like the guy behind the curtain. It's all smoke. I called it Merlin because it's magic, and magic meaning almost like a trick. Like if you know a card trick or a magic trick and you can show it to someone, and I don't want to say, are you fooling them? Are you tricking them? It's magic. And people might look at this from the outside and, I don't know, be overwhelmed, all these containers and all this PyATS, and it's just too much for me. Honestly, can you call up datatables.net for me real quick and for the audience?
Yeah, sure.
So I took a standard HTML table that was very good. It had network state data information in it. Someone from my community pointed me to datatables.net. Boom, I import some JavaScript. I import some CSS. It's that simple, honestly. They tell you how to do it. And now my tables look like these wonderful, searchable, sortable, filterable, and then you just build on it. So then I started to Google, Okay, what if I want to reorder my data table? There's a
Mhm.
little more JavaScript you need to add, and now you can resort them. So it's not necessarily me. I do this after hours and at lunchtime on top of a full-time career, an hour a night, a couple hours a night. I know I record a lot and it seems like I'm doing so much, but it's smoke and mirrors, Eric. It's magic. You know yourself, some of the Python you've written, do you almost feel like I almost feel ashamed sometimes. It's not that hard, guy. Like don't praise me that much. I didn't work that hard on this. It's Python. You just name your idea .py more or less, and the code will work, right? It's such a free and easy, such a wonderful experience to program with. I used to write COBOL and JCL and Kix and C++ and Visual Basic, and I've never had such a wonderful experience learning a programming language that I have with Python. And actually, I have a question for you. You commented that, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but
Sure.
you had sort of implied that maybe Flask or maybe Web to Pi or Fast API, or right, we have choices, much like we could use Ansible or PyETS or Nornier or Scraply. Do you maybe could you comment on, is it that Django is maybe perceived as complex, or do you really think it's more complex than something like Flask? I haven't used Flask, so I can't comment. But for
Yeah.
me, Django has been relatively, the same learning curve as any other tool that I've had to learn, right?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, you're too humble, John. So I remember, I think you started this whole Django path that like August, I would say, right? Like maybe even later than that, but and then, 5 hours later you have something running, and 10 hours later it's almost if you don't sleep, and then you have this portal running, and then you're getting into a deep end, right? So definitely, like and Roger, to reflect back to your previous point about people giving us credit just because, we kind of present something that somebody else made, and of course we're honest about it, right? Like we didn't make these projects, but because they learned it from us, so they kind of attribute it and associate that project with us. But definitely, it's something that the community was standing on shoulders of giants, and Django is a mature project and
Right.
so on. But back to your comment about whether Flask or Django is easier to learn or is it perceived. I personally feel it's real that Django has a higher learning curve. I think it's maybe because you have prior experience with HTML, and you were naturally grasping to the concept of model control view. But for me, for example, when I was starting out, I did look at all the major frameworks. So I went to University of Washington Extension's a Python program. So I think that the second semester was all about web framework, and we actually one of the core contributors for Pyramid was the instructor, and he actually taught us. We spent a week or two, learning Flask and Pyramid, and then Django. And for me, Flask at the time, I mean, I spent an equal amount of effort on all of them, but for me, Flask was a little bit easier to grasp. And the fact that, if you compare Django's tutorial and Flask tutorial, and Flask has maybe 8 lines, and then you just boom, you got a web page, and then you want a different web page.
Right.
Here's another function. And Django is like, okay, here's a poll, and now you have to do your make migration, and now you have to migrate, and then there's this view, you have to go to a template. So for somebody who is not as familiar with those concepts, so I think the difference, perhaps, I'm just guessing here, maybe you just have to learn Django, but not the all the other stuff around it. But as for somebody who's completely new to it, Flash seems to make the core light, and then you could have a little bit more brain space to learn the HTML part, to learn JavaScript, to learn CSS. At least for me, that was true. But like we were conversing, before hours and other times, that I eventually, Flask becomes anytime you need a real website, like production ready website with login, logouts, caching, backends, and all of these, right? Then if you build it with Flask, then you have to get all these add-ons, and maybe some
Okay.
database abstraction, or any kind of their login, or pretty forms for HTML. So you ended up having half a dozen to a dozen plugins. Then you start to and if everything works fine, that's great. But when you need to upgrade to the next
Right.
version, then you become the maintainer of interoperability between these packages. Whereas in Django, because so many people use it, and it's a mature project, and the core team actually takes the effort to make sure all of these are compatible. They did the testing for you. Like you said, there's no magic. Somebody else did the work to ensure the upgrade path was backward compatible, it's mature, it's frictionless, and so on. So those were my own experience. So we're both authors, and for my book, I choose to use Flask as an introductory portion for people to say, okay, if you want to build an API, here's what you do. You just have
Right.
to have 8 lines, and you don't even have to deal with views, right? Because for API, you just return your serialized object versus something else. But for production, once you get familiar with all these core concepts, then for production, I myself migrate all of my Flask projects to Django. So in a nutshell, that's me. But of course, you started with Django, and obviously you love it.
Well, I really appreciate that honest answer and that opinion. Again, I maybe if I did the Pepsi challenge and did a Flask project, I could probably verify that yes, it's I don't want to say easier, but it's a less of a barrier to entry. One thing when I was doing my research, I wish I could attribute someone to this, but I read something that said if you're going to try to learn Python, which is
Hmm.
what I was doing, really, I'm
Hmm.
still trying to learn Python. Django is you're not only going to learn Python, but
Yeah.
you're going to learn some SQL, and you're going to learn some HTML, and you're going to learn some JavaScript and some CSS and a framework. And it appealed to my 20-year-old computer programmer analyst self that actually had a class on SQL and had a class on HTML and cascading styles. It was very, and I just wrote a blog about this for packet pushers that now I know three-tiered architecture is kind of not really in flavor. We talk about micro services, and the three-tier architecture's kind of gone away. But
Yeah.
for someone who's maybe trying to conceptually think of what is this model view controller,
Yeah.
I think the model is the database layer in the three-tier architecture,
Hmm.
which usually would be fired off from the application layer, and only the application layer can talk to the database layer. And then we have our presentation tier, our web tier, that can only talk to the application layer, usually firewalled off. And it really clicked in my mind that I can develop this. And then, so I also, it was my own work, but I had accumulated so many Jinja templates that my HTML was a lot of, I don't want to say copy and paste, but bringing Jinja2 templating into Django templating. So I had a
Yeah.
lot of that already done. I had the PyTS already done.
Right.
Like you said, though, I had to learn the make migrations and I've got an SQL database now. Like, what am I, Jesus, it's been 20 years since I've done a select star all. I got a lot to learn here, right? So, but I'm
Your
really
hands a little
enjoying it. And I think
shaky.
that, oh, yeah, caps lock. That's all I know when it's time to do SQL. You turn the
Right.
caps lock on, right?
The SQL commands. But luckily, if you're using Django, they abstracted all of that, right? It's
They
just a class,
abstract
and it's
it.
just an object. Yeah.
I
But we'll
love it. I
definitely
love
link.
it. You can
Yeah,
go to
we'll
the
definitely link
Python
those. Yeah.
command line, right, and say
Yeah.
um, objects dot all
Yep.
bracket bracket, and there's every object in that database table Pythonically. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the tool.
Yeah, for sure. So we'll definitely link the link. We'll put links in the show notes for the articles. It's a good article. I've read it, and I think it's well put. I think you've put a lot of thoughts into it. The writing was smooth and the flow was natural. So
Well, thank
congrats
you.
on the article. I think it will help a lot of people. So we'll definitely put links in the show notes and people could benefit from it. Um, John, so I feel every single segment, like I hope I'm not rushing through this because there's so much to
No,
unpack. But
I know.
I do want to ask you, I mean, because we're like over the hour, but I do want to ask you about your opinion on looking forward. What do you think the future holds for network automation? What direction and what advice would you give people if they were starting out or making a mid-career change?
It's it's become there's another layer on top of everything that has been previously expected from a competent, high quality network engineer, administrator, operator, whatever it is you do with the network. That
Hmm.
is going to still stay the same. The OSI stack, layer two, layer three routing. But now, for better and I don't want to say for worse, but there's another layer on top of this that I think more and more organizations are going to come to expect from their engineers.
Right.
Python, REST APIs, Postman, VS Code, Git. It's not a long list,
Hmm.
but there are new tools that I think you have. I agree with Jeremy Schulman. He
Yep.
makes this point. In 5 years from now, this industry is going to be so different. It's going to be so much more programmatically driven. Software defined networking doesn't mean still does nothing anymore, right? Like we actually have controllers that are using north and southbound APIs, and
Yep.
we have to talk to those controllers. And I still believe the best framework is Python to do that with. I also work very closely with new intakes from the university and college system
Hmm.
in Ottawa,
Yep.
and I mean it. These new engineers, both a young woman and a young man that have just joined as summer
Yeah.
students, they know Python and they know as much as I knew about CCNA or N plus or whatever coming right out of school because of DevNet's change in 2020, DevNet Associate, all of these new materials. The universities have caught on, the colleges have caught on. So if you're in your, maybe you might get to retirement, maybe you might outrace automation, but it's a tidal wave coming at society. Truck
Yeah.
drivers are going to have to retrain because trucks are going to drive themselves soon. The networking space, every space around us in society is going to be impacted by AI, robotics, automation. We're no different than any other vertical.
Yeah.
I think we might be more at risk in our field if we don't learn these tools and techniques. I'm not trying to be doom and gloom. I think I owe it to people to be honest about their career, right? Like this is how people make their living. And I
Hmm.
think you're at risk if you're not growing and learning new skills, right?
Yeah.
So, that's how I feel about it, Eric.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree, and I think it's not all doom and gloom, right? It's a very
No.
exciting time. It's whenever you experience changes, change means opportunity, and you just need to kind of follow those opportunities. And right now, as you mentioned, I think it's pretty clear that network automation is here to stay. May not be the case 10 years ago if you ask network engineers, but now it's pretty clear that it's not a fad, it's here to stay. And also, I think I've mentioned this a couple other times that it's very exciting that Python has overtaken, C and or
I
Java
saw
for
you
these,
share that. Isn't
yeah,
that cool? Yeah.
20 years of dominance, and ever since they start tracking for the most popularity. Of course, take it with a grain of salt, right? So whatever survey or tracking, it's all just take a grain of salt, but it still doesn't diminish the fact that Python is very popular in network engineering, certainly, and in data science, certainly. Like John, you could learn Python, do network automation, but you could also progress like he did into web development, into data science, and all the host of other fields that are exciting. So John, I really appreciate. I mean, we could talk all day, right? And
I
in fact,
know.
we have
I know.
we
I
have
didn't.
talked
I
all
just
day.
looked at the time and I was like, "Oh, I'm keeping Eric here all night."
No,
I
no, no.
I'm
It's
just
great.
so yeah, I click with you. I really value your insight and your opinion and having this platform. I know you want to make it about me and the guests, but honestly, everyone follow Eric, follow these streams, support his efforts in elevating our discussion. He really has a unique. He was trying to school me on Elastic because he's written about it and he knows a lot more about it. And I was really excited to hear his opinion about Elastic. So reach out to Eric. He's a fantastic guy. And no, I mean that, Eric. This is a lot of fun for me. So thank you.
No, thank you, thank you. I appreciate you mentioning that, and of course, we could definitely agree to disagree on some points. But at the end of the day, right? Like technology is technology, and usually, we could make it work, and regardless of the
Yeah.
technology we use. But oftentimes, they're dominant technology in the industry that we kind of, even if we started out a different starting point, we'll kind of merge into that same point. And
Yeah.
that it's just funny how it worked like that way. But John, so obviously we'll put all of these in the show notes, but if people want to get in touch or know more about you, wants to get in contact with you, how should they do that? Is where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm very active on Twitter. I love to reach out to community people on Twitter. I'm open on LinkedIn to accept me professionally. No problem. Connect with me there.
Okay.
AutomateYourNetwork.ca. It's a little rusty because I enjoy writing Python more than blog posts, but there is still a lot of very good content,
Yep.
including a community links. So
Okay.
Eric, I'll have to get your links up on here, but if you go to community links, I
Yep.
really enjoy, and if you have something you want on community links, if you're watching this and you have a blog post or a video series, or Eric, I got to get your stuff up on here. It's for the community. So AutomateYourNetwork.ca. I've got a YouTube channel and lots of great stuff. And the other thing is about just before we go, I
Sure.
do have a book that I'm still standing behind. It's a very good quality book about Ansible and VS Code and Git and network automation. If you've been displaced by COVID, or you're unemployed, or you're in the developing part of the world, or you're a student, or you just can't afford it, please reach out to me and I will get you the PDF. No questions asked. Just contact me, okay? It's not about sales for me. It's about you reading the material. So Eric, thank you for sharing all of my platforms and content. And I'd be happy to come back, I know I'm coming back. So I'm really excited about about moving forward together as a partner with you in some of these podcasts.
Yeah, no, definitely. We will definitely. I mean, we already have things planned out, and because we're like minded, and it's fun to chat, and it's so boring to just hear me talk all the time. So we're definitely keep it going. We'll put it on the regular intervals, and of course, there's things that are in the pipeline. But thank you so much, John, for being on the show. It's great to hear your opinion. I think it's very valuable for people who maybe just starting out in their career to listen to someone who have gone through these things and experiences, and also for people who maybe in mid career that they're trying to learn automation. And so nice of you to share your book for for people who want to read it, or for people who are maybe don't have any other means to acquire it. But thanks so much. I really appreciate our conversation. So we'll definitely do it one other time. So thank you, John.
All right, Eric. Stay safe, everyone. And thanks again, Eric. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Network Automation Nerds podcast today. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other podcast platforms. Until next time, bye bye.